There's an ant on my notes. I'm trying to blow it away. All right. So welcome everyone to lecture 9. It says lecture 8 here, but we're going to finish up a few slides here, and then we'll move on to lecture number 9 for real. Uh, so if you recall from last lecture, we finished up the common filters from last class. Like we finished up that discussion, and then we talked about particle filters last class, where they're another filtering algorithm, which is basically trying to understand how do we estimate the state of the environment, given that we only have imperfect sensors from observation that can measure partial and noisy information about the state. And then we use particles to figure out where the most likely state might be, where each particle in a particle filter acts as one distinct hypothesis of what the true state could be. So I'm going to skip ahead to where we left off last class. So I think I want to briefly recap. I think where we left off here, and then I went through some of the examples. So let's just recap, what particle filters are again. Right? So particle filters, they represent beliefs as sets of particles, where each particle represents one belief. It's like one distinct hypothesis of what the true state might be. Now, in practice, there can often be duplicate particles that represent the same hypothesis. So if you're trying to determine, where the robot might be, then when you do the sampling with replacement to figure out like which location the robot might be, then particle filters do sampling with replacement. So we talked about that last time, where there's a set of particles, each with some weight, right? And then from those set of particles and those weights, you resample with replacement, you get another distribution, another set really of the same number of particles. But because you sample with replacement, you usually do get some duplicate particles. Yeah. So in some sense, they will represent the same belief about the true state. And other things are like with other filtering algorithm, then we compute the particle set or the belief recursively from the prior set. So it's like in common filter, then Bayes filter, where you have your current belief, and then we show the algorithm, and the input is like current action, current observation, and the prior. So the same principle applies here, where the beliefs are the sets of particles. Or if you really want to be mathematically precise, you could say sets of particle where duplicates are allowed. Uh, uh, if you really want to be strict in your interpretation. Yeah, and then we also talked about importance sampling last class. So importance sampling is a very general technique. It's widely used, not just in robotics, but also in statistics and probability. So, if you pay attention here, then it will help you in your probability midterms and final if you're also taking that this semester. Now, the specific use case of importance sampling here, that we have some kind of target distribution. So a target distribution, which is what we want, but we can't sample from it easily. And so what I found was when I was first learning about importance sampling, I didn't really understand like what it meant to be difficult to sample from, or like, why is something easier to sample from? The reason why it works in this case is because when we do particle filtering, we are starting recursively, like we have a prior set of particles. And so we already kind of know like, how do we sample from those? Like we can sample from those particles plus using the transition function to figure out which particle is like more likely than the other. And we'll cover that in the next slide. And so because we have like a discrete set of particles with weight to them, then it's easy to sample from. But the thing that we really want is the target. That's like the next step of particle filtering. And I'm like, it's not clear how do we sample that, but the way we do it is we use importance sampling to reweight the particle, and then we suddenly get the distribution that is our desired target one. Yeah. Yeah, so I hope that's somewhat clear. Like at least when I was learning about importance sampling, it wasn't in a robotics context. It was in a statistics class, and I didn't really quite get like what it really meant to be difficult to sample from versus this distribution is easier to sample from. Hi. So this is just like a quick summary of like where we left off, and I want to just go through a little bit of math quickly to cover like the importance sampling part a bit more. So if you recall, this was the particle filter algorithm. So we have the input, which would be the control at this time, the sensor at this time, and the prior set of particles. So here we're assuming that the particle set is size m. So that's why you have a for loop from 1 to m, it indexing over each particle, right? And then the outcome from this is another set of m particles. Yeah. And this was the recursive derivation where you have your belief here, which is equal to the, or really proportional to subject to the constant eta, multiplied by the sensor probability, multiplied by the transition probability, and then multiplied by the prior belief. Now, if you look at the book, they consider x from 0 to t, so it's not like Bayes filters where you only had xt. So here they do x 0 to t, and so they reason about the full history of where a single particle might have been. I mean, I think the reason why they do that is just to make it like make their argument mathematically more convenient when they're trying to derive the particle filter algorithm. And you can technically kind of trivial in theory to consider the particle filter algorithm with a sequence. So you can just, for each particle, just append the history of where it was at. So like each particle is a distinct hypothesis. Over time, it moves in whatever space you're studying. Like if you're doing 2D localization, then it's going to be the space of like 2D coordinates, and then the particle will keep moving, but you can always store the history, and then in theory just use that in the map here. And when you look at this, you see a weight here. So the weight here is where the importance sampling comes in. Because importance sampling, you have to sample from some distribution that's easy to sample from. And then you use the weight to, add more weight to samples that are more likely to have been drawn by the target. And then downweight samples that are less likely to have been sampled from the target. So the weight here for a single particle m, or the mth particle, is the target distribution divided by the proposal distribution. And we recall that the target distribution, the thing that we want to care, that the thing that we care about, like our target that we want to sample from, is this belief from x0 up to the current time, divided by this thing. So it's the belief from the prior time step, multiplied by the transition probability. And so the whole particle filtering algorithm does assume that you're able to sample from the transition function easily. So that's in my opinion, a very important assumption because that's not always true. But if you just assume that it's true, then it's easy to sample from the proposal distribution. Later, when we go to the real topic for today's lecture, lecture 9, then we'll talk about the transition probability for a specific type of robot, and then show that, if we assume this, then we can derive in closed form, the density, or you can easily sample from that. But yeah, but for now, just assume that you can sample from the denominator easily. Otherwise, you can't really do importance sampling. And then if you substitute this, like if you just substitute what we have here, and then you simplify, then you get like your weight is equal to the observation probability, like the probability of seeing your observation VT conditioned on the fact that your truth date is XT. And that's what the second for loop is doing. Like it's trying to sample each particle proportional to the weight. So yeah, any remaining questions on the mathematical derivation of the particle filter? Yeah. All right, and so just to give a little more intuition, so if you remember from last class, we were looking at this example of 5 particles. So there's 5 particles here. The reason for 5 is because it's easy to visualize in PowerPoint. If you're doing a real robotics application, you better be using like 5 million or 5 billion particles. But 5 here is just to make it easy for us to see on PowerPoint. And then, yeah, so that's what this XT means. So this XT represents like one set of 5 in this case. And then when we do the resampling, so the whole point of the resampling is to refocus the particle set in regions in the state space that have higher posterior probability. And the way that works is, remember that our inputs are the action or control UT. You have ZT, which is our observation. So if UT is the fact that the robot that we're trying to localize here is moving in this coordinate direction, then a, a reasonable transition model should at least move the particle from the upper left to the lower right. I mean, otherwise it's like a strained transition probability. And then if we assume that ZT is like the sensor data, so let's say the robot has a GPS sensor or some LiDAR or like range sensor that tells it, this is where it's probably located. Then ZT, this is the observation, and the weight should be higher for particles that are closer to ZT. So again, this is all assuming that we're doing like a localization example. We're trying to figure out the position of the particle. Like if our task is different, then maybe the observation probability has different interpretation. But here, let's just assume for simplicity that like if the particle is closer in like Euclidean distance to ZT, then it has higher probability. And we visualize that with the bars. So the higher the bar, the higher the probability. And this one here has the highest probability because it's closest to ZT. Any questions on the visualization, like this thing? Yeah. I do have the Google Doc open if you prefer to type in your question. All right, so what are some practical consideration with the particle filter? So after one like iteration, we have gone from this set of particles here, we have considered the action and the observation, and then now these are the updated weight. And what might happen is because we are sampling with replacement, we are going from a set of M particles to a set of M particles. So in here, it's going from 5 particles to 5 particles. Because we are sampling with replacement, what we have here is that there are like 4 particles that represent the same hypothesis. Because again, we have a discrete distribution, we could only pick 5 things, then because this has the highest probability, it's more likely that we have sampled from that. What's the problem here? Can anyone see why this might be problematic? I put it in the slide, so if you have the slides, you can like look ahead and answer my question. But it's better if you think about it than if you look ahead. Yeah, yeah. So what's the issue here now? Right. Right. Well, I know what some exam questions are going to be now. The particle deprivation problem. So what you're seeing here is that the particles end up like reducing to the like the number of unique hypotheses that they represent goes down because many of them got mapped to the same, like hypothesis, right? Now, yeah, if the true location is over here, then sure, maybe it's okay to have more there. But what if VT was like a noisy center and the real location is like farther, like somewhere like over here, right? And then suddenly we don't have any particles that are actually close to it. And then in subsequent steps, it's less likely that any of the particles are like actually close to the real state. Uh, so how do we fix this? How do we fix this? There are some bad solutions, and then there are some also bad solutions. All right, well, so there's a few ways that you can resolve. So the naive way is just make sure you increase the number of particles, right? So if you increase the number of particles, then yeah, maybe there are just going to be so many particles that some of them will be close to a true state, even if most of them might not be. Like another one you could do is to try to like if you start with the sample set of particles that have like reduced the number of unique hypotheses, you could always like try to inject more random particles or like maybe add some random noise to them. You could do that. But in some sense, like adding noise. I mean, you might not get like technically you might not get a true like posterior when you do that, but at the same time, if you have only a few particles, then it's also like the fact that the particle sets represent your true posterior is technically true when you increase the number of particles to infinity. So whenever you have a finite set of particles, you're always approximating a distribution, right? Because like with a finite set of samples, you can't like exactly approximate a distribution like a Gaussian. You can always get close to the true Gaussian by sampling enough from it, but yeah. Yeah, is everyone clear on like the particle deprivation issue? Like because you're sampling with replacement, you go from the same number of particles in the original set to the new set, but you've reduced like the number of unique hypotheses. So again, there's a bunch of ways that different researchers have and different practitioners have tried to overcome this. So another one that I didn't mention here, but another one could be to sort of add in more tricks like control the variance of the sampling process. But some of those are more advanced techniques, and then I think you can read them in chapter 4.3 if you want to. All right, so particle filters are often used in robot localization. So what that means is we have a robot that is in some environment. We assume that we know a map of the environment, but not the exact robot location. So again, you might disagree with the problem assumption, but it is a common assumption that we make that where we know some map. Now, maybe there's a floor plan that someone gave you, and then you have the robot, and you want to figure out like where is the robot like in the floor plan, and the sensors that it has. The sensors are like at least here the range finder. So what that means is you have a robot, then it shoots out some light to a to some like target, and then you measure the time that it takes to return, and then you can get a distance. And if you do that enough, you get some observation ZT that tell you something about XT, which is the true robot location. And yeah, particle filtering is a common technique used in this kind of setting. So last class I ended by showing this video. And one thing I want to be clear about is that if you notice the dot with I think they're like blue lines that are going to it, that's our estimated robot position. So I originally thought it was ground truth, but it's actually the estimated position. And you'll see that sometimes there's big jump in it, and then that's because the particle filtering algorithm, the most likely hypothesis, has changed. So let's look at this video again. So the samples are shown in red. So one particle is one sample. The estimated robot position is over here. And then here, well, they're using sonar measurement. And then you run the particle filter algorithm. Someone is making the robot move. Like that detail is not too important. The important thing is to understand the location of the red sample and what it means when, like how it relates to the estimated robot position. All right. So as time goes on, you see that the red samples have sort of converged to certain areas of the map, right? So what must have happened is that we have the data of the robot moving forward in that long hallway. Because it moves forward and it hasn't been blocked, then it's more likely that it's not in like this bottom region or this top region, because if it was moving forward, it probably would have hit some wall, and then the range sensor would have said, the distance is, well, it wouldn't be zero, it would be maybe 1 meter or 1 millimeter or whatever. And then it becomes less likely that the tube position is like somewhere in the region that doesn't have like a long, flat, thin part to it. So this thing is the most likely position of the robot. Now, if you look at the video, what will happen is the estimated position will keep moving, but then it'll jump back. And the reason for that is the robot keeps moving forward, but if the true position was here, then it would have moved forward and then it would have stopped. But if the true position is like a bit further back, it can still move forward and continue moving forward. While, if the robot was here, it would have had to stop. And then you'll see that that's why it leads to the estimated robot position being a little bit further to the left. So there's a jump. Yeah, so now there's a jump back. And then at this point, we become more certain of the robot position, so the number of distinct hypotheses becomes a lot smaller, which is characteristic behavior of a lot of particle filters. Uh, and then, yeah, here's another example of a particle filter. So they use laser as the sensor, and then by using that, you can determine, what observations are likely given the position of the robot. And then at some point, the estimated position or the particles end up converging. Now you see that there's also a set of hypotheses over here at the bottom, but then it goes away because it becomes less likely with the evidence that it's like been hitting a that diamond shaped thing here. And then at this point, it's so likely that the robot is like really over here that the number of distinct hypotheses ends up shrinking. All right. So to recap again, what we had covered today in last classes, we covered particle filter, which are a non-parametric filter, so we don't assume a specific distribution form like a Gaussian that we assume with the Kalman filter. And the advantage is that they represent complex multimodal. So anytime you have like multiple mode you should be wary of using Gaussian because Gaussians have like a single mode. Uh, and they could be relatively easy to implement because it's implementing a set of, I guess, a set of particles, then maybe you can do stuff like, vectorize things to make it a little bit easy, fast to run, but you might still have to do a lot of sampling. Yeah. And then there's also other issues that we talked about, like the deprivation issue. Um, and so real like practitioners will have to consider that when they work with particle filters. All right. So that's a summary of all the filtering techniques that we'll cover. So going forward, we'll cover some motion models and sensor models for like some special cases. And then that's like the remainder of what you need to know to implement different filtering algorithms. Uh, wait, no. All right, there we go. Oh, wait. All right, so yeah, welcome to lecture 9, which is the main topic of today. So today is going to be mostly on the motion and sensor model. So those are like the two remaining ingredients to implement some of the filtering algorithms that we have talked about. Although we'll spend a little bit less time on these because what we're going to cover today are some special cases of this motion model and this sensor model, right? And I think there are too many ways, there's too many variations to study. So we're just going to cover some example of some simpler models that we can, more easily analyze. Yeah. So yeah, some logistics. So, again, this was really supposed to have happened at the beginning of class, but we missed some stuff from the last class. So we are working on labs and homework, and keep an eye out for lab 2. So it's going to be out. I told the TA today, so hopefully it will happen today. Uh, all right. So some context. So again, remember our Bayesian network. So it has the control, the state, and the measurement. So again, this is really important. I know you might be sick of seeing the diagram a lot, but it is like one of the key assumptions that we are making about how our robot systems evolve and interact here. So far we have discussed several filter algorithms or filtering algorithms. But in order to like actually implement them, like unless someone is just giving you all the information that you need, then you will have to implement stuff related to the motion model and the sensor model. And another way to think of motion models are the state transition probability. So that would be the probability of xt given xt minus 1 and ut. And then the sensor model would be the probability of ZT conditioned on XT. And the reason for this is that we're making the assumption that we're following the Bayesian structure where like the given state is all we need to know. Like we don't need to know the prior state in order to make an inference on, no, on a current state or a current sensor. And for the motion model, we're going to consider the special case of when we have a 2D mobile robot. So again, it's kind of like the localization example that we saw earlier. There's a robot operating in 2D and it's like navigating. But more specifically, we're going to assume that the robot is going to follow or act like this. Yeah. I mean, you've seen this robot, right? It's like what do you call it, a Roomba? Okay. You have Roombas, right? I don't, so I don't know what it's like, but so what's going on is that there's some rotational or angular velocity that describes how it rotates, and then there's some translational velocity that describes like how fast it's moving in some direction. And this is the kind of motion model that we will try to analyze in a little more depth here. So again, this is just an example of a motion model. Like if you're using a different robot, then you might have a different motion model. Yeah. But this is just to make our discussion a little bit more tractable today by focusing on a specific type of robot. So we're going to assume that we have some robot here. There's a 2D coordinate system. So imagine you have like a top-down camera, and then you're measuring the coordinates of the X location and the Y location of the robot. The motion model is basically the transition function. So we're trying to see, is there a way that we can characterize the probability of xt given xt minus 1 and ut. So what is that? Now, the first thing that we need to do is to discuss, what does it mean to represent the state here? All right. So the state here is going to be the same as what I call the configuration. So the configuration is a formal term for specifying where is the robot, because that's the most basic question that you could ask. Because if we don't know where the robot is, then how can we actually do something with it? So, so I think we have a full lecture on configuration. It's going to be like sometime maybe in a week or two. But for now, just think of the configuration as a three-dimensional vector. So what are the three things? So the three things will be the X location and the Y location of the robot, plus this angle, which is the orientation of the robot. Like when you consider the angle, like the angle that points up, like the z-axis, the angle about the z-axis, that is what this means. So again, this is the configuration for this specific robot. If you're dealing with like a robot manipulator with an arm, then you're going to have more numbers in that configuration. But for now, we're just going to assume that the configuration is these three numbers. And yeah, just keep an eye out for the notation. So I tried to make it a little as clear as I could. So just remember that X is not the same as the XT and no stuff. So XT here is the full thing, right? Or XT minus 1 might be the full thing, right? So yeah. So what we're going to cover is what's called the velocity motion model. So again, this is a specific type of a motion model that applied to robots that are operating in 2D, that are moving around, and where we assume that we provide two inputs, a translational and a rotational velocity. So again, if you have like a different type of robot, then you'll need a different motion model. Like I'm just choosing this to make it as simple as we can to discuss like how do we analyze the motion model, right? But again, if you're working with a different robot, you'll have to adapt whatever we discuss to your particular robot. All right. Yeah, so what is UT? So UT is like the control or the action. And then we have the translational and the rotational velocity, right? And I think if you've seen how bodies move in 2D, then there's a general relationship between translational and rotational velocity. So if you look at this graph, there's R, which represents like the distance from some center to the center of the robot, right? And you can think of BT as like how fast is the robot moving, moving in sort of like a straight line, and then omega is how fast it's moving along the curve, or how fast it's moving, like how fast it makes the robot, essentially rotate something. So, like if there's more rotational velocity, then sort of like the radius here becomes a bit smaller because the robot is rotating more. Yeah. Yeah, so I think I saw a few videos online from, I think it's like from Khan Academy, if you've ever used that, and they show some examples of how this works. So if you want more examples of this, or a way, or if you want to look at more background on how this is derived, then there's a bunch of interesting stuff there. Yeah, and we do have this technical thing here, right? Like if there's no rotational velocity, then it turns out like this thing will just go, like this angle will be 90 degrees, but then the robot is just going to be facing upward, and so like the circle radius is infinite. Uh, yeah, yeah. Are there any questions about like the context of this? Like again, this is a specific type of robot and a specific type of model that assumes that we have those two inputs. So if you're working with something different, you'll need to deal with a different model. All right. So let's try to see if we can mathematically derive this motion model. So we have to pose at time t minus 1. So that's going to be x, y, and theta, right? So you have x and y, and then you have theta, which is this angle. So with those three numbers, that tells us where's the robot. Then we have the relationship that we talked about last slide. So again, it's like a general thing. Like if you look on the Wikipedia link that I put in the last slide, then you'll see how it's derived. And so one way that you can compute the model is, if you know the values of xc and yc, then you can use them in downstream calculation. So how do we compute xc and yc at high level? Like how do you do it? The quieter it is, the more likely it's going to be on the midterm. Yep. All right. I'll go through this a little bit slowly. So if you remember trigonometry, you can derive values of xc and yc by no by looking at this triangle. Did you want me to go through the math on? Um, yeah. Let's go through it. So I'll just go through one example, and then we assume that you can figure it out for the y coordinate. Okay. So all right. So let's say we're trying to find what this is. Then this angle is theta minus pi over 2. I don't know why they use degrees because radians are superior to degrees, but I don't know. Oh yeah, so if we have this, then the xc here, like this this is like the distance x, so that's what this is. Then if you do the math here, so cosine of theta minus pi over 2. What is this? So this is this thing divided by that. So it's uh, So I have x, and then if I move this over here, it's x, right? Yeah, so that's how you get the first line. So it's, yeah, x equals xc plus r cosine theta minus pi over 2. Yeah. And yeah, then why does this line make sense? Like, why does it make sense to go from this line to this line, like cosine of theta minus pi over 2 to sine of theta? So if you do you remember how the graphs look? Like they're it's basically the same graph, except if you subtract pi over 2, then everything they coincide. So you can plug in sine of theta here. Yeah. And then you just rearrange and then you get that. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know if people, if the recording is going to capture this. Yeah, I mean, well, hopefully this would encourage people to attend class because I can't like always capture this on the video. But again, this is just your trigonometry, so hopefully if the verbal explanation with the in the recording will help drive the math. And then how do you do y? So it's something similar, right? Except you start with sine and then you go to cosine, right? Yeah. So it's something similar here, except the only difference is that when you go from sine of theta minus pi over 2 and then to cosine of theta, then you have to insert a subtraction. If it's not clear, you could just go through and verify it yourself with like sine of 0, sine of pi over 2, and see how it maps to cosine. Uh, yeah. All right. So by doing this, we have derived what xc and yc mean. And then what happened when there's a little bit of motion, right? So what happened when you have like, you have B and you have W, omega. Sorry, I shouldn't say W is omega. Yeah. So these two numbers represent the control, right? So after the control happens, then like, what's the next state? Like that's the whole point about doing this. We want to know like, what is the next pose? Like that's what a motion model is. So our initial pose is x, y, and theta are after the motion, it's going to be x prime, y prime, and theta prime. And then, so yeah, think of the first term as xt minus 1, and then the next thing as xt. So that's why we're using x and x prime here, because otherwise we would be overloading what x means, right? So we want xt to mean the state, and then x prime is like, no, the next x coordinate. So just repeating what we had last slide. So if you remember, we had this like xc and yc. So I'm just repeating them here. Then after the motion, what happened? So this is what happened. The point of this math here is to show like, how do you mathematically characterize x prime, y prime, and theta prime? So let's look at the angles, right? So you have, yeah, so if you have theta, and then you have a little bit of time. So that's what the delta means, like depend your time delta, and then you have your omega term here, right? So if time goes up, like if you have a lot of time, then it's more likely the angle had changed a lot. If you fix time, but your omega goes up, then the same thing happens. Like you just moved a little more. So the way to think about this is that we have some, yeah, maybe here. So you have the robot here, and the robot is moving there. So if omega is bigger, then it's like you move more. And so the your old angle becomes like some theta value, then depending on how big omega is, like you get a bigger angle. So because if you have more velocity, you end up moving more. Yeah. So that's what we mean. That's what it means when you have theta prime is equal to theta plus omega times the time delta. And because this is the angle theta, then this is the angle of consideration, and then sometimes we just substitute our angles here with with the updated angle, right? So to do this, you just plug in the values of x and y here, right? Yeah. So hopefully the first line is clear. Then the second line is just like rearranging stuff to make it equal to the prior state plus something. Yeah. So again, just think of these terms as the current angle that represents the configuration of the robot. Yeah. So this is all right. So again, to recap, this is an example of a motion model. What we have done here is given our current or given the pose at like the last time step, we have determined, condition on our motion, what is the next pose. That's the whole point of a motion model. Any questions up to here? Hmm. There's nothing in the Google Doc. Yeah. So to summarize, you add to your current angle based on the time moved and the angular velocity. That's just changing whatever angle is inside your sines and cosines. And then here you rewrite it as your old state plus new stuff. And then for the next time step, you just repeat this. And then that tells you the formula to determine the next pose, given the current pose, plus the action. Again, that's the whole point of your motion model or the transition model. So what we were assuming is that we have derived the next state after some motion, which assumes that it's like exact motion or that there's no noise. So if you remember what I've been talking about a lot in this course, like what happened when, like what should your reaction be if I say, let's assume that we have exact or no noise? Like what should your reaction be? Is your reaction, I agree with you 100%? So do you agree that when we execute an action on a robot, there's always no noise? Okay, yeah. So again, whenever you command something on a robot, like it's gonna go to somewhere to where you intended, plus or minus some noise, right? So and the way that this particular choice of a transition model or a motion model is to model this with a zero-centered random variable that you can use to model noise, right? So if you have like a robot system that you suspect is particularly noisy, then you could set that parameter to be some high number, right? Which represents a lot of noise. And then you can consider that in your full system to try to, I guess, mitigate or to deal with the effect of noise in the system. So what this particular motion model does is it assumes that you have your B and the omega term. So that's your action that you executed. Now we're going to assume that you can model it with this zero-centered random variable where you have epsilon, or if you're typing it in LaTeX, it's bar epsilon. I'm not sure why. This is a zero mean error variable with variance based on the thing in the subscript. So again, what's happening here is that for our motion model, we assumed last slide that you could express the next state as equal to the current state plus something that is a function of your v and omega. So now we're just going to change things and assume instead of v and omega, just use v hat and omega hat. Yeah. And then everything is basically the same. Except you have to, you have to assume that you have some estimate of what numbers to put in for, like alpha and the alphas here. Yeah. So like this alpha represents how much do we think that this system is going to have noise, translational noise here, plus how much we think the system has noise in the rotational, or angular velocity and how that interacts with the translational velocity. Yeah. So again, this is just a modeling choice, but it's one that the velocity motion model has chosen to use. So in practice, if you're working with the system, if you're trying to rely on the system to predict what is the next state of the robot given the current state plus the motion or plus the action, then in practice, you would just come up with some estimate of these alpha terms, and then you just pass it into the calculation from there. Now, some common error distribution are the normal distribution. So if I say something is zero-centered noise, then the first thing that probably should come to your mind is a Gaussian distribution or a normal distribution. So interestingly, I didn't realize this, but another popular choice is to use a triangular distribution. I mean, the triangular distribution has the shape of a triangle, so hopefully it's kind of intuitive like what this means. So, yeah, and this thing is bounded too, so like it doesn't go beyond the minimum and maximum ranges, where like the Gaussian is technically unbounded, except like in practice, if you sample from it, you're not going to get something that like way out over here. So, all right. So this model here, what you see here is the old motion model. So it's just x prime, y prime, and theta prime, that's the next state of the robot, is equal to the current state plus something that depends on the action that we took, which is two terms, the translational and the angular velocity. So again, I think the point is you don't need to go through these numbers. Like I don't memorize these numbers. The bigger point to me is that it's the old state plus something that we know. Like that's the bigger point to me. Yeah, I mean I don't actually memorize what this means. So unless I'm using this model in practice, then I would probably want to know it. But just think of this as an example model. And then what happens when we try to incorporate our noise term? It's basically a trivial substitution. So all you have to do is just do this. You take the bottom row, and then you change v into v hat and omega into omega hat. So again, like for me, the bigger point here is that this is a function from your current state plus something that depends on your action that consider the noise that you're assuming that the robot has, and that equals to some next pose. Yeah. So again, you don't have to memorize what's inside here. Like I mean, I don't memorize it, so I'm not expecting you to. So yeah. So again, this is just a model. It may or may not be a good fit for your problem. But if you're modeling something that is like the Roomba robot, and then you have those two types of control, then this might be a good model. Yeah. But again, if you have a 6 degree of freedom manipulator arm, you're going to have to do something different. Now, I think one other last thing is that, so again, the model that we've been talking about, it assumes a circular trajectory. So it's like you have the 2D robot and it's moving in a circle. Yeah, like this. So this is the model from the last slide that is your current pose plus something that depends on your action with the model noise equals the next pose. And in practice, what the velocity motion model actually does, it introduces another noise term that assumes that you're not actually following an exact circular trajectory. So it's sort of like instead of, it's actually a good example of because when humans draw, we can't draw an exact circle, right? Like, let me try though. Yeah. So it's not, this is not an exact circle, right? So I think the intuition here is, if you don't want to assume that you follow an exact circular trajectory, then added another variable that represents noise in following this circular trajectory. And what's happened here is that they include this gamma hat term to model this noise. So it's another term that represents noise. They don't put it in the other two terms, it's just with the angle here. Yeah. I'm gonna get rid of this because I don't like seeing the circle here. Uh, yeah. And if you're looking at the textbook, then the link is the readings are on the course website. So every time you see a lecture, you can see the reading. So if you want to look at this in a little more detail, just look at this part in the book. And I guess the other nice thing about this type of model is that because we sort of know how to compute it, we can also then derive a sampling algorithm to sample the next state. And then if you sample enough time, then you get a sense of what is the distribution of the next state given the current state. And by the way, I've been saying things like state and pose, they represent the same thing here, like state, pose, and configuration here. They're basically the same thing for today. Yeah. So big picture, given prior state and the action, sample the next state, assuming a velocity motion model. So you sample robot-specific parameters that determine the variance of the noise that you're trying to model here. And then you're using those to determine the equation that we derived from the last few slides. And then you return the next sample. So here's an example of what it might look like. So here are some samples from the velocity motion model from the textbook. So this is describing in a sample fashion probability of xt given the current x or given at least given the previous xt and the current action. And so the model A here is showing that we assume we have moderate errors for all the components. B is smaller angular error, larger translational error. And C is higher angular error and smaller translational error. Do you see why that's true from where the dots are located? Yeah, so if we have our 2D robot and if we assume that there's higher angular errors, then the angular error determines how much where it rotates. So it might, if you have a wrong angular, or some error in the angular velocity, it could like instead of consistently going in the same, rotation, it could, go here or go here or go here. So there's a lot more variance and where this can be. And that's why if you plot it, the shape is something like this. So that's why you see how that curved shape in that direction. All right. All right. Any questions on the figure here? All right, so I think this is a good time to take a break. So we are moving on from motion model to sensor model for the rest of the lecture. So let's take a 5-minute break, everyone, and then we'll be back at like 5:08 or so. All right. Very quiet today. No. And I see that they're reacting, but it's not like raised hand or whatever. Yeah, like this is yes, omega like angular velocity, and then d is the translational velocity. They call it the translational velocity, but like you have a 2D robot, how do they use like a straight line? Yeah, just a kind yeah, linear. I guess we call it linear. So I think actually two different parameters. Well, we're assuming that the robot can language, right? But if it's only a straight line, then he's talking all that help rotate the direction. But like when you have a 2D robot that is moving, you need to be able to, if you have one thing that tells you go in a straight line, you need a second thing that tells you in which direction to go in the straight line. And I think what this example is assuming is that you're doing the straight line and the rotation at the same time. So it's like this.
So why we come to use the X right here to that X down the Y. So use like a tiny circle in the short period. In the short term period.
You could use delta X and delta Y. I think you could. You might be. I think when you're coding and using the robot, you might be telling it changing X and changing Y, but maybe on this it converts that to those B and omega. I think it's also a choice that this motion model makes. This model is assuming which goes to Y. Maybe there's other models that are doing Y achievement and that's achievement of it. So I guess we got all right, I think we should get back. Yeah, the breaks are turning into 6 minutes instead of 5 minutes, so we can. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So yeah, hello everyone, and hope you had a good break. And so for the rest of today's lecture, we're going to switch topics and cover sensor models. So this is chapter 6 in the textbook. And here, instead of looking at the transition probability, we're going to look at the observation probability. So the thing that we're going to care about is this thing here, the probability of xt given yt. And the motivation here is to try to actually model this type of noise to account for uncertainty in different sensors, right? So if I tell you that this sensor is perfect and noiseless, what's your reaction? Your reaction should be, I'm wrong. Okay, yeah. That's the whole point of like probabilistic robotics and probabilistic, model of your system, right? Yeah. All right, so there's many different sensors. So a common sensor that people have used are LiDAR measurements. So you target some object with a laser, measure the time that it takes for the light to return, and because the speed of light is a constant, unless you're in some strange universe, then it's a constant, then you can use it to derive, what is the distance to an object. So I think if you read the book, they assume that they basically assume that you're in some kind of map, right? You have a map of the environment and the robot is inside it and then trying to navigate through it. But the concept of the sensor probability is broadly applicable. It's not just assuming, LiDAR, but the book uses examples of, like LiDAR and rangefinder just to make things a little bit concrete. But Yeah, so I thought this video was good, a little bit fun because it showed that this is an example of a different type of sensor, and it's also more recent because I guess this is from a few years. You can tell because of the math, right? Um, so so this is with TRI, and yeah, so the motivation here, because when humans are doing stuff, like we often make use of our whole body instead of just the hand. So it helps to have sensors like tactile sensors that cover the arm of the body, like this. Yeah. So the woman here is one of my former colleagues at Berkeley. So she's now working at Toyota Research Institute, where they're doing a lot of robot manipulation. So they have different sensors that you know. I guess if they make contact with some object, then you get some kind of signal. Like depending on the resolution of the sensor, you might get like a very high dimensional image, something that looks like an image, or you might get some different internal representation. But the point is that you use these sensors that tells you like your VT, right? Your the observation conditioned on the truth date, which is like what's the exact position of the object, right? So you don't know that exactly, but you use the sensors to tell you an approximation of it. Yeah. Yeah. So if you try to shake it, it can be pretty robust. I'm trying to see if they have an example of of what the tactile sensor, like what the data looks like, but I don't think they have it in this video. So yeah, it's mostly just to give you a sense of like what state-of-the-art people are doing these days. Yeah. So if you look at the video, they also have some, I think, oh yeah, so they have some hugging here. I don't want to show that, so that's yeah. You can watch it in your own time. Yeah, question? All right, so the question there, does the robot need to know the weight of the object before grasping something? I don't think they provide that information to the robot. I think when the humans set up the robot to interact with stuff, they're usually going to pick objects that are like not too heavy. And also like different, I think this is a tangent, like it's something different from the sensor model. So the point of showing this funny example is to show an example of what is a sensor, right? What is something that gives you your observation VT given the truth date, which is the exact position of the object or something. Yeah. I mean, in practice, when we set things up for a robot, or if we deploy a robot in a home, we'll want them to handle things that are like a reasonable weight. And also, robots have a certain payload, so like something that they have to be under a certain amount for them to like lift things. Yeah. So we'll see some more examples from TOI later in the course. All right. So we're going to model the measurement as a conditional probability density here. Now, in practice, when you're dealing with a sensor, you're not going to get one bit of information, but you're really going to get a huge amount of data, right? So if you have a camera, you're going to get an array of numbers. If you have a rangefinder, you're going to get scans of ranges. And if you have that like tactile sensor, you're going to get a big data structure that stores the information from the tactile sensor. So, notationally, just think of VT as like uh, all these different T1, T2, and so on. And again, if you're reading the book, they assume that you have the map of the environment. I mean, maybe you don't if you're not doing like localization or whatever, but we're assuming that's usually the case when we study the textbook. Yeah. And if you also want to, you can make a conditional independence assumption depending on, if you think it's justified for your sensor and your problem, then sure, go ahead. All right, so now we're going to talk about sources of measurement error. So consider a rangefinder that measured the distance to nearby objects. And then we're going to try to build a model for P of ZT given XT and M. So the point is to build a model for this. It's kind of like building a model for the motion model, the transition thing. Like we assume robot is this thing, and then you can do like next state is equal to the current state plus the action plus noise that we're modeling. Yeah. All right. And the one potential model here is to consider these four different sources of measurement error. So you might have local measurement noise, you might have unexpected object, you might have just random failure, and you might have random measurement, right? So for each of these four, we'll try to think about what are the sources of error and how do they impact the distribution of the sensor that we care about, right? So here the rangefinder is going to be like measuring one distance. So it's like a single variable so that we can plot it and visualize it. In practice, you would have to have many different variables, but this is just to make it fit on a PowerPoint. And so each of the four different measurement noises, there's a corresponding distribution that will show with it, which characterizes how we're going to model that particular type of error. So if you look at local measurement noises, then ideally rangefinders, they find the correct distance to an object. So when you have the rangefinder, it shoots a light beam, you measure the distance to something, and then you get a number, right? Yeah. But again, I already told you, like if I say that the range sensor is noiseless and perfect, your reaction should be no, it's not. Yeah. And what you can try doing is, well, if it's like a local measurement noise, well, like if the true distance that you're measuring is like ZTK star, then this is like the true thing. The distribution here represents the modeling assumption we're making about what is like the density of the distribution of actual measurement that we would get from our sensor, given that the true underlying value is this thing, which we don't directly know, but you can try to model that, assuming that it's like some distribution around the true value. Yeah. And the way that you can model that is by using some Gaussian, right? So if you have like local measurement noise and you just assume that it is a small amount, then assuming that it's zero center around the true value is like pretty reasonable. All right, so unexpected object. So what happened when there's unexpected objects like people walking around, and that causes your sensors to tell you something different, right? So maybe you can take some time to think about like what would the distribution look like? Like what's the reasonable choice of like the shape of the distribution that we should assume if we're trying to model this. I mean, it's in the slide, so like try not to look ahead, but I can't stop you. So well, you're not getting that on the midterm. Yeah. All right. So if we have unexpected object, then one reasonable choice for modeling that error could be a distribution that looks like this, where this is like our true, distance, but the actual value that we get from the range sensor, it might be distributed according to, to this distribution, right? And whenever we have unexpected objects, if they appear like behind the thing that we're measuring, then what happens? Uh, like if I'm trying to model the distance from me to this thing, and then if other people appear behind it, then it's not going to change what the sensor gives me because it's like behind it, right? I'm only measuring the closest thing in some direction. But if someone comes in and then blocks the sensor, then the value that I get from the rangefinder is going to be something shorter, right? It's gonna think that the true distance is somewhere closer to zero. Yeah, yeah. And the argument for why the function looks like that is because if you have like multiple things, multiple possible, unexpected objects that appear, then in order for like if you have like two objects that appear that could appear, then if there's one that's closer to you, then it automatically determines like what the sensor gives you because it's the closer one. So it doesn't matter what the second object does. But if you reverse it and you want something that is like closer to VT K star, then you need one object that is like at this distance, but you need the other object to be like far away and not actually blocking it. So that's the argument for why this model decided to make this curve, this shape like this. Yeah, and then the reason for why it stops here is because we're not modeling local measurement noise, right? Because that was the prior model. We're going to combine them later. Yeah. So if you're only trying to model unexpected object, then you could just add in this distribution. Yeah. So you don't need anything after this. All right, so what about if the rangefinder just failed? Like if it's trying to measure the distance of something, but it just fails to do that for whatever reason. Then what would be a good modeling choice for that? Like what would the plot look like? I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it, or to peek ahead at the slide. Yeah, yeah. So, so you're questioning what is the meaning of the rangefinder here? Uh, the rangefinder here is just the example of it's just the sensor that we are assuming we're using, right? There's many different sensors. There's like that tactile sensor that I shared from the robot, without that padding on it. That's an example of a sensor. The rangefinder is an example of another sensor. We're going to assume that our robot is using that rangefinder. But it's just an example sensor. And the way it works is it just tries to measure the distance to nearby objects. So your sensor will point somewhere, and then it gives you a single number that says, here's the distance from here to something. Yeah. And the point of all this is to build a model for what is the probability of the reading that we get from the sensor given the truth date and the map. So the truth date and the map would be like the true position of the object. The ZT is like what the sensor is giving you, like it's a number that I'm getting. Or in practice, many numbers, like not just one, but let's just assume that it's one number to make it simple. And the point here is to try to make modeling choices for like, this is one possible source of noise, this is another possible source of noise, and so on. So you may think we need other sources of noise here. Then if you think that way, then that's your modeling choice, and you should build a model that reflects that. I think I say that a lot in this class. Like if you disagree with this model, then you should build something that you think is more plausible. Like that's what I'm trying to make sure it's a little bit clear. Like a lot of these are modeling choices, and then you have to decide if it's going to work for your use case. Like in practice, if we give you like a homework problem, we'll probably just say, please assume this model. But if you're operating a robot in your own time, like in your research or job or hobby, then you would make these choices. Or just take it from someone else. I don't know. All right, getting back to this. So yeah, so if we assume that there's like random failures, right? Your sensor, your rangefinder tried to measure the distance of something, but it just failed. And what you could assume is that, well, maybe if this failed, it's just going to return the maximum possible allowed value. So you might get just like the max. So like that's the maximum possible value. Like, I mean, most rangefinders, there's some distance that it can return. Like it can't really, like I think most rangefinders, they don't necessarily work if you're like on top of a mountain and trying to measure some faraway point. It's more reliable if the distances are closer. Yeah. So you could model this by, let's say, if it fails to find the object, it's just going to return the maximum possible value. That's the max. And then it's going to be a discrete point mass distribution. So that means all the math is over here. So like it's a discrete distribution with probability 1 if it returns a value, the max, and probability 0 of everything else. All right. So the fourth source of measurement error that we might consider are just random measurements, right? So maybe the sensor it tried to measure something, but it just had like a random problem that, hard to predict or hard to describe what happened, or it just failed. Then what could be a reasonable distribution for that? Oh yeah. So someone said, yeah, uniform distribution. That seemed like a reasonable assumption. So sometimes rangefinders produce stuff that we can't explain. So to keep it simple, just use a uniform distribution over the measurement range. So we have these 4 measurement errors to consider, right? So what do we do with them? You have different distribution. What do we do with them? It's a very common technique in probability and statistics. So you can model them with some kind of mixture model, right? So everyone familiar with mixture model. So in machine learning, if you have a mixture model, that means you have different distribution, and then every sample is going to be, you first like pick one of those distributions proportional to its weight, and then you sample from that distribution. So that's how you get mixtures of Gaussians. Like that's how you can get bimodal distribution, like the bimodal experience of this class. So some lectures you feel very good, others you feel very bad. So if you plot the distribution, you might need a bimodal mixture of Gaussian to model that. So what could happen is if you apply a mixture, depending the way that it will look vary depending on like how you set the coefficients of it, but it might look something like this. Now, if it does look like that, then it's a sensor that has a lot of noise, right? Because a lot of the math is like way over here. But the reason why they do this is just to show like that what the noise looks like. I mean, hopefully the distribution is more centered around VK star. Like that would be better because it's a less noisy sensor. Yeah. So if I say that here's a sensor that doesn't have as much noise, then your reaction should be, well, that's okay. I mean, not as much noise is not as extreme as saying no noise. Uh, yep. And then the way that we might model this is your probability of ZTK, which is the probability that you get your particular rangefinder reading is conditioned on XT, and the map is equal to this thing where the transpose, so it's like a dot product between all of these coefficients plus these different distributions that you get. All right. So to summarize, we covered ingredients for implementing the filtering algorithm. So we covered motion model. So that's like the state transition probability. So we assumed that we're following a velocity motion model. With noise and error. Like, so I don't always put in with noise and error because otherwise I would have to do that for every like line that I write in the slide. But just assume that that's always there. And then sensor models, we assume that there's a rangefinder model, then we try to model like how the noise, different sources of noise might affect the distribution of different sensor readings that we might get. All right. So now we've covered, all right, so stepping back, we've covered what are these ingredients for different filtering methods. So we've covered, not only motion models and sensor models, but for the last few weeks, we covered state estimation too. So up next, though, we're going to discuss some broadly applicable topics. So this is a bit out of date. So I imagine we're going to cover like localization next class, and then we'll cover like different optimization and configuration-based techniques, because I think your next lab, which should be out soon, it covers localization. So I'll try to cover it next week so that it helps you. And then I expect that we'll see like another distribution. Like if you look at the distribution of views on the YouTube, like it's very high for lecture 4 when I talked about lab 1, though it might have another spike for next class. But still, please show up in person if you can. So yeah, that's all I have for now. We're going to end a little bit early today, so I could stick around for a few minutes if you have a question. So yep, I'll see you Monday then.